Not long after I became a Christian, I was travelling home on the train to the village outside York in which I grew up. And as I was travelling home, I was idly looking out of the window when I was suddenly gripped by a conviction that it was all going to be all right. It was a sudden, overwhelming sense of God's peace. I was actually a bit unnerved because I wasn't conscious in that moment of anything I needed reassurance about. So the irony was that in the moment, the reassurance from the Spirit was slightly alarming. Our family home was on Station Road, and it was a short walk home. As soon as I walked through the door, I found out why I needed to be reassured. My parents sat me down straight away to tell me that my dad needed urgent surgery. Aged just 47, he was to have a quadruple bypass in a few days' time. In 1986, that was quite a big deal. They looked wrung out and incredibly stressed. That was why I needed reassurance. It was so kind of the Holy Spirit to do that. And I wish I could tell you that I shared that peace with my parents and lived triumphantly in that peace throughout my dad's stay in hospital and his long recovery at home. But I didn't. I didn't share the assurance I'd been given with them. Faith was at that point a really tricky subject at home, and I'm not sure they would have listened. And I didn't dwell on the assurance that I'd been given either. In passing, it didn't really help that my dad was being treated in the woefully named Killingbeck Hospital in Leeds. Yes, really, that was its name, the Killingbeck Hospital. It was only looking back that I saw how God had shown me his sovereignty, shown me how actively he was reigning in my life and that of my family, even of someone like my dad who didn't at the time know God for himself. I mention that because this morning we're thinking about we worship because we know God reigns. We worship because we know God reigns. First key to this, remembering who Jesus is. Remembering who Jesus is. John had been exiled to Patmos. We're not told why, only in verse 9 that he was there because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. So his faithfulness to Jesus and his calling has provoked the authorities to exile him to Patmos. If you don't know where that is, that's because it's a tiny island in the middle of the Aegean Sea. It's the kind of definition of the middle of nowhere. But when lost in worship in verse 10 on the Lord's Day, John is interrupted by a loud voice like a trumpet. That voice commissions him to write to the 7 churches on behalf of the one speaking to him. I hope you noted the vivid language in verse 12. I turned round to see the voice that was speaking to me. To see the voice that was speaking to me. Presumably, the voice had such conviction and power that John was urgent to see just who it was who was speaking to him. But if the writer of Revelation is the Apostle John, I think he also recognized the voice. I wonder if he was hungry to see his friend again, one he hadn't seen since the ascension. What John sees is someone like a Son of Man in verse 13. Now, Jesus often referred to himself as the Son of Man during his earthly ministry. And the background of that is Daniel 7, 13 and 14. We read in verse 13 of Daniel 7, Daniel saw one like a Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. And the key is, I think, the next verse, Daniel 7:14. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Daniel 7:14. That's the background to John's vision. Hoping again perhaps to see his friend and master as the risen Lord, and overwhelmed to see the Son of Man revealed in his glory, he turns and faces the voice. The risen Jesus is described in a priestly manner. He's walking among the lampstands to ensure that they don't run out of oil as the priest did in the temple. The lampstands represent the 7 churches to which the risen Lord is sending his message through John. A message that's going to be both prophetic and encouraging. That is, I think, how we're supposed to understand that the risen Jesus is tending those lampstands, tending those churches. That's how he means them to not run out of oil. His voice, John tells us, is overwhelming. He compares it to both the trumpet in verse 10 and the sound of rushing waters in verse 15. And his kingly authority is undeniable. He holds the 7 churches like stars in his hand, according to verse 16. And the words with which he speaks are compared to a broadsword. It has a sword literally with 2 mouths, meaning 2 edges. Seeing his former friend now thus transfigured before him overwhelms John. Verse 17, when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. I guess what comes next, Jesus had done countless times before to John during his earthly ministry. He lays his hand on John in blessing, as I'm sure he'd done hundreds of times. And then Jesus says, do not be afraid. He's saying, I think, you know me. You know who I am. So don't be overwhelmed with awe in my presence. You know, John, that I am not just the crucified one, but also the risen one. As he says in verse 18, I am the living one. I am, always harking back to the divine name Yahweh. I am who I am. I am the living one. I was dead and now look, I am alive forever and ever. He's saying there can be, John, no end to my reign and authority because I am the living one. As the one who is both first and last, I hold the keys of death and Hades. Nothing can take that away from me. Nothing can take that away from you, John, and all who follow me. The vision we have in Revelation is of a Lord in whose hand are held the churches which he tends, churches for which he has a purpose to bless, churches for which he has words of challenge that will restore their life and their health and their passion. First key to worshiping because God reigns is remembering who Jesus is. Remembering who Jesus is. The second key is looking for his hand at work. Looking for his hand at work. We're blessed with a large back garden. I can just about say that with integrity because we're also blessed with being able to afford a gardener. For I am a conscript, not a willing volunteer when it comes to gardening. So I can just about see it as a blessing now that I don't have to spend the whole of my day off doing it. There are lots of trees in our garden. Even on hot evenings when everything seems still, even then somewhere there will be a breath of wind. Even on the very quietest, stillest of days, somewhere at least a few leaves will be stirring. Why do I mention this? Simply because God will be at work in and around you. It's not whether God is at work in and around us, it's how and where and whether we discern it. Even when it feels like the driest of dry seasons, and even when it feels at its quietest and stillest, even then, God will be at work in and around us. So we need to look for the stirring of the wind, the stirring of the leaves. Look for it and get involved. If you've got a Bible, I'd love you to turn to Romans 8. Because Romans 8:28 is notoriously difficult to translate. Which is why if you had one of the church NIVs in front of you, you would realize that it offers 2 alternative translations in the footnotes. That is a sign to all who know anything about translation that this is tricky to translate. One translate suggests that every outcome will be good for those who love God, that all things work together for good to those who love God. But that seems like a promise that it will automatically happen that it is inevitable, that there's some kind of process that happens that will just be inevitable. But our passages suggest otherwise, don't they? It also treats circumstances as the agent, the subject of the sentence, which is tricky grammatically. I think we have to see that the verb is the key. And that verb is work with or work together. So who or what works together? Who or what works what together? We could take it to mean that God works the circumstances together for good for those who love him. But I think, as the RSV suggests, we should take it to mean that God works together for good with those who love him. God works together for good with those who love him. That latter seems best to me, that the verb work together with is between God and ourselves. So I'm going to translate verse 28 as God works all things together for good with those who love him. That it's not an inevitable process, but it's rather a partnership between ourselves and God. What makes this as a translation seem more appropriate is that it makes sense coming after everything that Paul has just been saying in verses 26 and 27. If you look back in Romans 8, there Paul talks clearly about partnership, about how the Spirit helps us in our weakness, surely working all things together with us, about how the Spirit prays in us and through us, interceding for God's people in accordance with God's words, God's will. So in those verses, there's such an intense sense of being indwelt and of being in dependent partnership with the Holy Spirit. If you go a little bit further back, verses 22 and 23 talks about us groaning inwardly in prayer. So then verse 28, talking about partnership with God, simply continues the theme of the previous verses. So we're understanding verse 28 to mean that God works all things for good with those who love him. He's contending in everything with us for our good. All of that is simply to say that we should look for his hand to be at work, that we should expect it, that we should expect to see signs of how God is working, shaping the circumstances around us. That we should look, in other words, even in the driest and most difficult seasons, we should look for the stirring of the wind. We should expect to see signs of blessing, signs of favor, signs that show us that God is at work in our daily lives. And then remember to thank God for them and also to ask for them to multiply. We should look for his hand to be at work. I wonder where God has been at work in and around you. And maybe you haven't noticed it, or haven't looked for it, haven't named it, thanked God for it. Ask God to show you how and where he is at work in and around you at the moment. This verse, translated as we have done, encourages us to believe that God will be. It's not a question of whether, it's a question of how. But of course, it also challenges us. How are we playing our part? As we're translating verse 28, God works all things for good with those who love him. We're not simply to sit back and wait for it to happen as if by an automatic, inevitable process. Rather, we're challenged to play our part, challenged to pray and seek to discern where the stirring of the wind is, how God is calling us to be involved. Going back to that reassurance on the train for a moment, I was given a clear opportunity, even invitation, to work together with God, to bring his assurance and peace to my mum and dad. And honestly, I missed the moment. I missed the opportunity. Not only did I not stand in that peace myself, I also didn't help them to receive it. When looking back, I'm sure that was God's purpose. I missed that opportunity to enter into partnership with God and to join with him in releasing that presence and power to others. Where might God be inviting you to work together with him at the moment? In one context, in what relationships might God be inviting you to be at work with him? Third key to worshiping because God reigns: standing on his promises. Standing on his promises. I love the story of Peter walking on the water for lots of reasons. We're always a bit glass half empty about it, aren't we? We focus much more on the fact that Peter sinks than on the reality that Jesus enabled him to walk on the water, and he did. And of course, that when he started to sink, have you ever noticed, if you've heard me preach on this, you will have noticed, Peter chooses not to turn and dive back to the boat when he's sinking. He chooses to reach out towards Jesus, who's still standing on the water further away from the boat. We read in Matthew 14:30 that it was as he saw the wind, as he saw the storm and the waves around him, that he started to sink. It wasn't that he looked away from Jesus, I think, but rather the waves swept across, driven by the wind, and he is in a moving seascape that's going up and down. And in that moment, he lost sight of Jesus because he could no longer see him through the waves. And when he lost sight of Jesus, that's when he saw the waves and lost faith that he could do what he was actually doing. Sometimes circumstances mean that we lose sight of Jesus. It's not that we question he's there, or at least not most of the time, but that circumstances or problems have blotted him out. We're no longer looking from Jesus to our circumstances. Rather, we're overwhelmed by what faces us, and we're unable to look beyond it, unable to see beyond it. In that moment, we are seeing the waves and the wind. We're seeing the storm. We're confronted by circumstances or problems. We can't see beyond them. And in that moment, we can no longer stand our ground, no longer stand on his promises. But in those moments, it's absolutely key to learn to stand on his promises. We need to fix our eyes on the risen Jesus. And even when we are seeing the storm all around us, even when our circumstances feel overwhelming, keep looking the same way. Keep looking towards Jesus, knowing that he has not gone anywhere. I don't know if you've ever experienced a solar eclipse. We experienced a total eclipse in Devon quite a number of years ago. And we saw the whole of nature fall asleep around us. But we knew it was never going to last. It was always passing. Likewise, we might lose sight of Jesus in a season of challenging circumstances and suffering. Yet he can only be eclipsed for a moment. And even then, if we stand on his promises, if we keep looking the same way, keep looking towards where we know he will be, even if we're not able to discern him for a time, we can keep asking for his presence to be renewed. Keep asking, trusting that he will honor his promises. In those moments, Paul tells us in Romans 8:31, when we feel that things and people and circumstances are against us, we have to remember who is in our corner. We have to remember that God is for us. And remember that if God is for us, it hardly matters who stands against us. In those moments, Paul tells us in verses 32 and 33, those moments when we're feeling guilty and rubbish and unqualified, we have to remember that God, through Jesus, has justified us and graciously given us all that we have received and will give us all that we need. In those seasons, Paul tells us in verse 34, where we feel rebuked and useless and undeserving, we have to remember that our risen Lord isn't just at the right hand of God, but he is also there praying for us. We need to stand on his promises. We need to ignore the sight of the wind, the waves, the storm, and trust that the eclipse will pass. Final reason why we worship, because God reigns. We remember how it will all end. We remember how it will all end. I love that verse 35 asks, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Paul almost treats these as characters in a film, these challenges, trouble or hardship or persecution, famine or nakedness, dangers or sword. And he says, who are these guys? They feel like real threats, yes, but they're also trying to appear bigger than they are. So we shouldn't allow them to intimidate us. Why? Because we know how it will all end. It will all end with us in the hands of the living one. It will all end with us knowing the presence and power of the one who is alive forever and ever. It will all end with the one who holds the keys of death and hell. Even if these things happen to us, Paul is saying, even if that happens, they cannot separate us from the love of Christ. So he's saying, and I think you need to understand that he's banging the table at the moment. So even though these things, these characters want to intimidate us, we must not take a backward step. Why? Because they cannot separate us from the love of God in the risen Jesus, the living one. Cannot. He says death cannot. Principalities and powers cannot. Nothing in the past, the present, or the future can. Neither being raised crazily high in cultural status nor being humiliated in the worst way can do it. No created thing can do it. When intimidated by all of these characters, Paul says in verse 37, we need to remember that we are literally over-conquerors. We're going to conquer over all of them. We won't just win by a little, he says. We will tear through the finish line, overcoming them all in Jesus. All we're doing is allowing him to be victorious in and for us. Why do we worship? Because he reigns. That means remembering who Jesus is. It means looking for his hand at work. It means standing on his promises. And it means always remembering how it will all end. I wonder what the challenge or invitation is to you this morning. Do you need to remember afresh who Jesus is? Maybe encounter him afresh, as did John, by a fresh touch from his loving hand. Do you need to look again for his hand to be at work in and around you? Look for the stirring of the wind, even if it's an incredibly dry and difficult season, to look for the stirring of the wind, because it will be there. It's not a question of whether God is at work in or around you. It's a question of how. Look for it and be willing to play your part in that for yourself and for others. Where have you allowed Jesus to be eclipsed at the moment? Where are you seeing the storm, the wind, the waves, rather than standing on his promises, waiting to be able to see him again? And where do you need to rouse yourself to be an over-conqueror and to be reassured that how everything will end in the presence and the hands of the living one?